Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Paul. I'm a professional astrologer, and today I will be analyzing the birth chart of Marilyn Monroe. And I'll be doing that from a psychological, astrological perspective. For some reason, Marilyn entered my mind the other day, and I went ahead and looked up more information about her because I've never had a lot of knowledge of Marilyn, except for the usual image of her as a goddess-like actress who tragically died young. And I will admit I was surprised and somewhat shocked or disturbed even by what I discovered as I was delving a bit into her life and background. Marilyn, as you may or may not know, had a very traumatic childhood. And the more I read about how her life unfolded, the more I became interested in analyzing her chart for myself. I wanted to see how all that information would correlate to her astrological signature. But I also wanted to gain more of an understanding of her psychology beyond that, the potential within her which she may or may not have been familiar with. I will be using what's called the Porphyry house system for this reading. And so there are a couple of changes to the chart compared to the usual Placidus house system chart found online. Now, the changes are minor, but if you wish to have a look at that chart, you can find it at a place such as astro.com, for instance. I also want to mention that I won't be considering the minor aspects in this reading, nor go into every detail concerning each element of the chart. And for those of you out there who are learning astrology, I actually encourage you to focus on interpreting a chart in such a way as to get to the core, the main themes, and to communicate those. And always remember, use your intuition along the way to guide you through it. The first thing that I like to do before delving into the various elements of any chart is to get a general overview of that particular map, so to speak. And in Marilyn's case, we can clearly see how a lot of what is going on in terms of planetary energies is focused on the western and upper part. These represent outer life and dealings with others. The exception is Pluto, the North Node, Neptune, and last but not least, the planet Saturn, which you find located at the bottom of the chart. All this seems very fitting already with the general view most of us have of Marilyn's life. However, let's delve into the elements and hopefully begin to understand Marilyn Monroe and her chart better. I like to begin with Pluto, as a planet representing deep emotional dynamics that operate as a foundation for the rest of the chart. The method of starting with Pluto is borrowed to an extent by astrologer Jeffrey Wolf Green and his evolutionary astrology. However, I won't correlate Pluto with previous lives as he did, but I have found it extremely effective in explaining psychological security needs we're all born with, and which we thus gravitate towards unconsciously and in fact quite compulsively. In Marilyn's case, she was part of the Pluto in Cancer generation from 1913 till 1939. This is important here because, as we will see, she has the Cancerian symbolism or archetype emphasized within her chart and psychology also beyond Pluto. And it is crucial in helping us explain and correlate her childhood and her traumas that clearly affected her throughout her entire adult life. As I mentioned, Pluto gives us information concerning psychological security needs, and in the sign of Cancer, we're dealing with really deep ones. The issues of home, a family life, and parental dynamics are highlighted for her and her generation. But as mostly is the case with Pluto, the mythological god of the underworld, this territory is not an easy one. So for Marilyn, we can recognize how her early home environment was dramatic and traumatic. She grew up with a mother who was mentally ill. She was orphaned and experienced abuse. In her case, the Plutonian symbolism in Cancer couldn't be more graphic. She was, metaphorically speaking, taken to the underworld already in her formative childhood years. Imagine that. And speaking of imagining, with her Pluto being in her 12th house, she must have been able to both imagine and fantasize about a different life. A life that she was later trying to escape from and cope with by the use of pills and through isolation. If we look to the 4th house, the natural home and house of Cancer, we see Saturn, located by itself at the bottom of the chart. Again, the security needs, what Marilyn craved, would have been a home, a safe haven, so to speak, and an emotional depth of union, also represented by the sign of Scorpio. But with Saturn, there is often a denial early in life of those very things that one craves. So Marilyn was clearly denied the very things that she so deeply and probably unconsciously yearned for. The fact that the ruler of the 4th house relates back to Pluto in Cancer in the 12th, and its ruler again being the moon, underscores the hiddenness and an inner isolation. And the emotional undertone of her chart and psyche is seen here. When the ruler of the 4th house is found in the 12th, there is often a feeling of separateness from immediate family, and sometimes even an orphan feeling. In Marilyn's case, this was an objective reality even. It is very important, though, not to jump to conclusions when reading a chart. It has more to do with observation correlation, such as in this case. Also, we need to be cautious when conveying our interpretations of the symbolism of the chart in general, but especially with Saturn in the 4th house, just because we're dealing with delicate psychological material. When it comes to Saturn, we can also relate the planet to Father Time and the reward, so to speak. The attainment of what we yearned for, what we craved, often come about later in life as we mature. I find it interesting that Marilyn decided to settle into a home, her own home, just a few years before her death. We also know that she very much became part of the family of her therapist eventually. And so we see how that became a surrogate for her. I want to continue with her moon. To me, I perceive Marilyn as a lunar individual at the core, even though, as we will see, she was, metaphorically speaking, married to and identified with the Venusian archetype quite consciously, but that the motivations or explanations behind that identification were in fact unconscious and lunar. We find her moon located in the 7th house. And even if this gave her a certain perceived warmth or caring, it's often not an easy placement for the moon as such, when you have the underlying dynamics Marilyn had. The 7th house, as we know, has a lot to do with our dealings with other people, especially on a one-to-one level. The moon, however, is our private emotional domain. Now, what happens when we associate the two? One answer is vulnerability. She was vulnerable through what she received from others, how they affected her, and at the same time, she would have had an emotional effect on them. Quite unconsciously, as is the case with the moon, she would have had a gravitational pull on others, and in her case, based on the opposition aspect to Neptune from her moon, that pull would have led them to the Neptunian realm of fantasy and idealization. The strong collective unconscious forces would be supporting that. All this is Neptunian 12th house material. With that also, the fogginess or blurriness, and the changeability which she also represented. With this placement of the moon, as we keep her childhood background in mind, she would have undoubtedly have been searching for a sense of security, a sense of emotional belonging via others, particularly then through partners. This would create an emotional dependency on them, which, when exaggerated, as is likely with her moon conjuncting Jupiter, makes the inner emotional security suffer. So she would be searching for even more substitutes or ways to compensate or escape from that pain. There were, of course, lessons there for Marilyn to learn. That inner emotional security, as we see with her Pluto and North Node in Cancer, and Saturn in the fourth house. But for her, having the moon in the sign of Aquarius and its ruler located in the eighth house in the sign of Pisces, it would require for her more of a detachment, or being able to objectively get a perspective of delving into her own personal unconscious, her suppressed and repressed emotions. This was something she was, of course, trying to do ultimately via therapy. Interestingly, her moon sign Aquarius is a paradox as far as the emotional domain. It's an air sign or psychologically related to the thinking function. But the moon is still the moon, and what we can learn is the emotional need she had for greater belonging. Similar to that connection with Neptune, a spiritual universal belonging, in the sign of Aquarius, we're dealing with more of a humanity at large or a connection to like-minded or other individuals who might have felt like a seed sown at the wrong time or out of season, not fitting with the standards. There is an inherent contradiction with Aquarius, as well as its ruler, Uranus. On the one hand, community, group, belonging to one. And on the other, isolation, aloneness, and independence. Her moon makes a square to Saturn, which underscores a certain aloofness or restriction when it comes to the emotional domain, and an actual union or fusion with another, as represented by the sign of Scorpio. The square is indicating a clear tension. No doubt she had difficulties and challenges integrating that Saturnian lesson in her fourth house. But I want to say that regardless of what we know of her life, in any chart, Saturn in Scorpio in the fourth house has everything to do with the deeper layers, the unconscious. The potential or reward for working on and integrating the Saturn, though, with the moon for any individual having that placement would be great. And to me, it speaks of a counselor. The moon can also tell us about our mother relationship and how she was perceived by us, regardless of the actual objective circumstances. Some assign the fourth house to the female parent, the mother, while others, the father. Either way, though, here it shows us that the Saturnian symbolism concerning the mother had a direct impact on her emotionally regarding emotional security. And we also know that the father was never in the picture to begin with, so I guess in her case, we can assign the fourth house to both parents. When our moon is in a connection via aspect to Saturn, we first need to recognize that fact before the actual aspect. For instance, in my own case, I have my moon in a trine aspect to Saturn, and it adds a certain emotional, self-protective structure and thus hindering at times when it comes to expressing feelings due to underlying vulnerability and insecurity. However, the Saturn-Moon connection also provides a deepening of feelings. Many are not aware of, though, that Saturn can run very deep. The connection also shows us that our mother was in some ways perceived as a bit aloof, perhaps, or unavailable emotionally. Now, if we consider the difference between the trine aspect, which is my case, with the square aspect, Marilyn's case, it does say something about how well we were able to digest or integrate that aspect. With the trine, we often cooperate, if you will, better with the Saturnian energy, whereas we might struggle more with the square. However, this is not in any way a fated fact, because if we consciously choose to dive into the issues, we can certainly reap rewards later in life as a consequence. That being said, a square is still a square, and it'll always hold a certain tension and be a challenge for us for sure, especially with the moon involved. I want to move on to the sun. The sun represents our conscious ego identity, the center of our consciousness. It is an integrating factor in our life, just like the ego can be in our psyche. It represents conscious goals, meaning, and purpose, and we're always in the process of becoming our sun. Whereas the moon pertains to the unconscious sphere, the past, and shows us our lifetime mood, our reactions, and emotional habits, and so on, the sun is continually looking forward, sparked by flames as represented by sign, house placement, and aspects. A Gemini sun rings true to how we've perceived Marilyn. Her spontaneity, wittiness, her fickleness and charm, her duality. They're especially represented by her acting ability, taking on different roles. But Gemini is a left brain thinking sign, an air sign. And so Marilyn had a dimension that was quite the opposite of everything I mentioned so far. Considering the conjunction with Mercury, also in Gemini, and that Mercury only makes a major aspect to her sun, concentrates that mental energy and fuses it strongly with her consciousness and personal identity. The fact that the two planets are placed in different houses using the Porphyry house system doesn't really matter in my opinion, since they're in the same sign. If anything, it shows us that her Mercury, thinking and communication factor, possibly has an objective element to it, and that she was able to utilize her Mercury to facilitate her conscious goals without it running away with her, if that makes sense. Through observation correlation, it is obvious that she did this well. Through her work, it is clear. I've also learned that Marilyn read a lot in general, although how she fed her intellect and mind privately, well, it's not for us to know, of course. Interestingly, her sun only makes a major aspect to Mercury if I disregard the sextile to the ascendant. So it is like her sun and her Mercury then have taken on separate roles from the other actors of her chart, so to speak. And since the sun is an integrating factor of the chart and psyche, it also relies on aspects usually. But since these are few and almost missing as far as major aspects, it becomes more challenging to integrate the other factors of her psyche via the ego, her sun. It's as if it operates compulsively and independently. I want to mention how any unaspected planet can become a focal point of the chart and psyche. And it's also the case that the sun doesn't always play a strong role in someone's life because it can easily be projected and dethroned, if you will. And if this is the case, it'll live its life through another, maybe a partner, or fester in the unconscious. However, some individuals are also more lunar by nature. In Marilyn's case, though, the sun is located at the top of the chart, and so it's being emphasized by default. As you can see, the sun in Marilyn's chart is placed at the beginning of the 11th house. So we can use words such as icon, eccentricity, social life, different people, community, gains from career, etc. I think they all ring true to her sun, her conscious ego identity. She was certainly unconventional, and in many ways appeared liberated, also sexually, which also has a lot to do with her Saturn in Scorpio. She exaggerated the Plutonian scorpionic energy, possibly as a means of dealing with the insecurities and as a defense mechanism. We can certainly sometimes exaggerate or deny our Saturn sign placement. But let's have a look at her 8th house, speaking of Scorpio. We locate her Mars and Uranus here, both in the sign of Pisces. Mars, her conscious will and drive, located in the 8th house, gives us a further hint of understanding that sexuality and sensuality which she irradiated. So on the one hand, it could come from the Saturn and Scorpio placement, the exaggeration I mentioned. But here, it is, like I said, an actual innate instinctual drive that operates. Mars can be very aggressive and attainment-oriented. But in the sign of Pisces, it goes about things a bit differently. Marilyn's sexuality and sensuality had that certain unmistakable Neptunian, outer-worldly, and divine quality about it, which made it a product of fantasy and of dreams, as it relates back via house and sign ruler to her first house, and the way that she wore that robe as part of her identity, first house in Leo, but also self-deception via the inconjunct aspect with Neptune. However, as we know, the 8th house is not just about sexuality. At a deeper level, we're dealing with an emotional union and fusion with another. Here, it differs strongly from the 7th house of relating. The 7th house has nothing to do with emotions in and of itself. So Marilyn must have ventured out to find that fusion and union, and to seek it also via imagination and maybe spirituality as represented by the sign of Pisces, and mysticism as related to the 8th house. I believe her Mars in Pisces also shows us that she was a person to reach out to someone less fortunate, to be compassionate and sympathetic. As far as her vitality goes, Mars in Pisces often need cyclical time to withdraw, to realign themselves and recover, quite frankly, from the strains of life, physical life. And seeming Marilyn worked a lot. All those expectations, the pushing, the keeping up with, must have been really tough for her. And so she found ways to cope with that as well, by the use of drugs and through isolation. Uranus here tends also to relate to fear of emotional abandonment, of betrayal based on experiences of violations of trust, which was very much the case with Marilyn's early life, as we've seen. But with this unconventional planet, the planet of great perception, as the ruler of her 7th house moon, there would have been a strong potential, together with Mars, to dive into the personal unconscious, the deeper layers of the psyche, and to penetrate the underworld of her own reality. This is a gift that Marilyn carried here in the 8th house, whether she embraced it or not. And had she not become the movie star, again, I see the potential for the counselor archetype. Finally, I'm going to address Marilyn's Venus and Chiron. We live in a time when we lack goddesses. We're looking for someone to admire, for someone to become a true star. Sometimes we elevate women to that status, and Marilyn Monroe became one of those stars. She became the recipient of admiration, embodying the projection of beauty and femininity. In many ways, she became a projection of a version of the Roman goddess Venus or the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Now, Marilyn, unfortunately, must have been willing, due to her tragic childhood, to play out this quality, to be liked and admired as a substitute for being loved. An unconscious decision, of course. For those of you out there who are interested in Jungian depth psychology, I encourage you to read about what's called the anima. Because Marilyn Monroe, in many ways, could be linked to what's called an anima woman. I'm not going to delve into that in this chart reading, of course, but I want to say she did become a projection, especially for men. And so she was losing her identity as a consequence of an over-identification with her Venus and the anima archetype. Normally, if we see a woman's Venus in Aries, we'd think of the passion, the enthusiasm, and maybe also the restlessness. Not only that, but Marilyn's Venus is in the fiery house of Sagittarius. And this is all accurate, but in order to interpret and understand her Venus, we need to also understand her Chiron. Because these two are married in a conjunction in her chart. Just as with her Sun and Mercury, though they are in different houses, here we find what's called a same house conjunction, but in different signs, since Chiron is located at the very beginning of the sign Taurus. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the mythology behind the small planet or comet Chiron, I encourage you to read about it. As with all the planets, learning about and understanding the mythology is extremely helpful when interpreting a chart. What I find interesting in the case of Marilyn is that her wound, her trauma, was in many ways directly associated with her mother. She was rejected by her, regardless of the various conditions of the mother. Just like the centaur in Greek mythology, Chiron was rejected by his mother. And this mythology leaked into Marilyn's femininity. Another aspect of Chiron is that as an actual spatial object, it has what we could call an erratic orbit around the sun between Saturn and Uranus. And this is another Chironic feature we see with her romantic interactions. Venus, as we know, is also associated with those, and especially strong when added to the sign of Aries in a fire house. Added to that, Venus makes a strong sextile to her Jupiter in the 7th house of relating. And so all this very much affected her dealings with others, especially with partners. So what we see here is that the wounded healer archetype heavily influenced Marilyn's values and also then her self-worth. I've seen Chiron and Taurus to have this effect in general, also in my own life, having that object placed at the beginning of Taurus. There is a certain wound or scar concerning oneself that needs to be confronted and understood. And in Marilyn's case, we have the added fusion with Venus, which also has its natural domain in Taurus, and so it intensifies it, and in addition, it's directly connected to her femininity. What's more though, as a mythological creature, I want to mention here how Chiron traded his immortality for mortality. Because even though he was an actual healer, he was never able to heal himself. However, he did become immortalized again, not as an actual star, but he did become a myth. And I find this symbolically fascinating when linking it to Marilyn's destiny. It's just very strong. Chiron, who was a centaur, half horse, half human, located in her 9th house, the natural Sagittarius house. Well, this is very fitting with the mythological creature himself if you read about him. Beyond that, Chiron in Taurus gives love for music, and Marilyn was actually very fond of classical music, and as we know, she sang well and had an alluring voice. She was charismatic and had that innate potential for utilizing artistic resources and talent. To conclude, to me, Marilyn Monroe lived out a lot of her Venusian identity, but she was taken over by it due to her background. And even though her personal planets, including her moon, were in masculine signs and houses, at an unconscious level, with a watery Saturn and Pluto, both in watery houses, she was connected to an all-embracing mother archetype for good and bad. Also, Having that fixed energy connected to her moon and Saturn signs, along with the sun, indirectly via being placed in a fixed house, it tells me that she had an underlying reluctance to all the change, to the commotion. She would have needed and ultimately tried to find her space, her solace, and her belonging to a greater womb, as represented by her North Node in Cancer in the 12th house. Thank you very much for listening to this reading. I hope it was helpful to you. If you want me to delve into your personal birth chart, then please don't hesitate to contact me. You can do that by visiting my website, realmofsoul.com. Again, thank you very much, and until next time.